Good evening, everyone. I can't see you because of those slides, but hopefully you've got a good view of the platform here. My name's Anne Taylor, and I chair the Hansard Society at the moment. And this is a particularly important year for the Hansard Society because it was founded in 1944, which means that this is our 80th anniversary year. And it really is quite a critical time for parliamentary democracy. I think we're seeing lots of signs that pressures are there, that trust is diminishing, and it does, in fact, create some real challenges for us all. The Hansard Society was founded by a combination of support from Winston Churchill and Clement-Attlee, crossing that political divide. And they thought there were many challenges to parliamentary democracy at that time. And as I say, I think that they are still there, although perhaps in a different form. Throughout the history of the Hansard Society, it's been considered a very trusted interlocutor between different parties, different groupings, dealing with all parties and trying to be constructive and effective. And I don't think anyone has ever accused the Hansard Society of being partisan. I think the Hansard Society itself describes itself as the critical friend of Westminster and focuses on remedies to address some of the weaknesses in the way in which Parliament, and I would say particularly the House of Commons, but maybe I'm biased, but the way in which Parliament works. Now, there is a leaflet on your seats, and this outlines the 3 priority areas of the current work of the Society. Improving the way in which we make law, and in particular regulations, supporting the next generation of MPs, and I think the last generation had a very difficult entry because they'd only been in Parliament in 2019 for a very short time when COVID struck. But also we need to look at transforming the language and the rules of the House of Commons so that procedures and processes in Westminster are easier to understand and engaged with. So over this anniversary year, we're hosting a number of events, and at the heart of them will be the debate about how our Parliament and our politics can be more effective and how we can all help, not just politicians, but wider public and media as well. And that's one reason why I'm very pleased that we've got students from several schools in this area. I think many of us think that students don't get involved enough and aren't often invited, so it's very good that you could come this evening. So what we have this evening is the inaugural Churchill-Attlee Democracy Lecture. And it's our intention to invite a prominent speaker each year to reflect on the state of parliamentary democracy in the UK and indeed around the world. And we were really delighted when the former Prime Minister agreed to give this lecture named in honour of her predecessors and our first members. We did invite Theresa May before she announced that she is to retire from the Commons at the next election. Nevertheless, after 3 decades and having served extensively throughout some of our more turbulent years, I think that we can say that she is well placed to reflect on Parliament now and indeed think about the future. And so we're very grateful to her for giving up her time. And this is, as I say, not just the first of our anniversary lectures, but also the launch of our 80th anniversary appeal. And all the ticket sales this evening will go towards that appeal. I think perhaps people don't understand that the Hansard Society does not receive any public funds. It doesn't have any rich benefactors. It is actually quite hard work to keep the show on the road. We're an independent charity and we rely on what grants we can obtain, and our membership and indeed donations are very important. And it is 20 years since the Hansard Society last had an appeal, and that was to mark the 60th anniversary. So it's not that we come cap in hand very often, but I think events like tonight do help to focus the spotlight on the work of the Society and the need for support. The proceedings this evening will be presided over by my friend and fellow trustee, who probably needs no introduction to everyone here. Jackie is a former political journalist, I don't know that you don't still dabble a little, and broadcaster, who has seen the work of Parliament and indeed the Hansard Society over many years. So thank you to Jackie for agreeing to do this. Thank you to Theresa May for agreeing to come. And I'm sure that we will enjoy this evening's discussion. So Jackie, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Anne, and welcome to you all. And apologies if my voice is getting a little bit squeaky. I'm suffering from hay fever for about the first time in my life, and it's not fun. But if my voice runs out, Teresa's agreed to interview herself afterwards, so that'll be fine.
Provided my voice doesn't run out.
Yes, it's that time of year, I'm afraid. But it's lovely to see so many of you here. Thank you very much indeed for coming. The format's going to be that Teresa will give her lecture. She and I will then have a little chat about, I've already had a little glance at it, there's some very interesting points I want to pick up from it. And then we're going to have questions. We've already had quite a few questions submitted, so we'll sort of group them and we'll take some from the floor and some that have been sent in. So hopefully we'll have a bit of a discussion as well afterwards. We will finish promptly at 8:30 because that's when I think we get chucked out. But we have still quite a lot of time to come. So I'd just like to say I first really came across Theresa May when I was a Guardian journalist. She was a Conservative MP, so not natural allies, you'd think. But I was working in those days, back in the 80s and 90s, 90s, not the 80s, with Harriet Harman, who was trying to increase the number of Labour women MPs. And Theresa had seen some of the stuff we were doing and asked me along to, what was it called? Westminster Women. What were they called? A lot of Conservative Westminster women that you were setting up.
Oh, Women to Win.
Women to Win, that was it. And asked me along to come and speak to them. I remember this rather shocked reaction from her colleagues. Who's this Guardian journalist you've invited? But anyway, there started a very good conversation, didn't there, between Conservative and Labour women that continued over many years. So many fellow feelings there. Teresa needs no introduction. She entered Parliament in 1997, when Tony Blair's landslide took place, probably not the most propitious time to become a Conservative MP, but survived those years in opposition with many a shadow responsibility job. She became Home Secretary in 2010, served for 6 years as Home Secretary, and then after that became Prime Minister in 2016. And so we're delighted to have you tonight, and we very much look forward to hearing your lecture. And can I invite you to take the lectern? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie, for that introduction. And it is indeed an honour to deliver this inaugural Churchill-Attlee Democracy Lecture, and in so doing to mark the 80th anniversary of the founding of the Hansard Society and to launch your 80th anniversary fundraising appeal. And it's fitting that you've chosen to name this lecture after your first two members. Sir Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee were both distinguished statesmen, but first and foremost, they were parliamentarians. They believed in the power of our parliamentary system to maintain stability, to provide good governance, and to enhance democratic accountability. They were committed to the ideal of Parliament as the representative forum of the nation. And they were champions, Anne, for the primacy of the Commons as the elected chamber. It's indicative of that belief that they both opted to remain active participants in political life after Downing Street, and I'm proud to have followed in that tradition. And it has been a privilege to have spent the last 5 years participating from the back benches, although it was a rather unfamiliar existence at first. I'd only been a backbencher for a year upon entering Parliament before I was appointed to the opposition front bench. And I spent 12 years auditioning for government, holding 11 different briefs, serving under 4 party leaders. As you've just heard, in 2010, I joined the government as Home Secretary before becoming Prime Minister 6 years later. Now, as you'd expect, a lot has changed over those years, much of it for the better. I'm glad to say that, reference to what Jackie's just been talking about, there are many more women in Parliament now, for instance, but there is still much more we can do. So, as a Member of Parliament approaching the end of her 27 years tenure, I'd just like to share some reflections with you on my time in public life, on the state of our democracy, and on how it could be made stronger and more effective in the future. First, we should ask ourselves, why democracy? Churchill said, it is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that have been tried. And of course, democracy does have its flaws. But alongside our values of liberty and justice, of our commitment to the rule of law and to an open market economy, democracy has been the platform upon which modern history has been built. Over the last century, we've seen tremendous progress in virtually every major area. Life expectancy has increased from around 55 years old in 1920 to over 80 today. Infant mortality has plummeted. We've seen the development of revolutionary medicines and treatments, rights for women and minorities that were once an aspiration, we now take as accepted. We now have universal access to education and higher levels of literacy than ever before. The advent of personal computers and the internet has changed the face of everyday life beyond recognition. And with significant growth of our economy, we've seen a huge rise in living standards, with average incomes multiples of where they were 100 years ago. So we have much to be positive about. But it becomes easy to take our way of life for granted, to take our freedoms and values for granted. Establishing the superiority of those values was the result of centuries of sacrifice. And just ask yourself, would this degree of human progress have been possible through an alternative means? Had Churchill and Attlee not succeeded in their fight for freedom, had history taken another turn, could we expect these same achievements in a less open society, one without the rights and freedoms we've enjoyed, under the control of an overbearing state, with little freedom of expression or thought, with innovation stifled, with no wealth creation to raise our living standards and to enable us to care for those in need? I think not. We owe democracy a great debt. And to ensure our values endure for generations to come, we must therefore cherish it and conserve it. If we fail in that endeavour, we will all pay the price. But we must be honest with ourselves. Democracy is in trouble, here in the UK and around the world. We know from opinion research that support for our democratic institutions is wavering, especially among the young. The most recent United Nations Human Development Report showed that for the first time ever, more than half the global population supports leaders who may undermine democracy. Polling by Kext CNC for the Munich Security Conference showed that over the last 3 years, support for democracy across the developed world has fallen. Of all the countries surveyed, support for democracy is lowest in the United States and Canada. And it revealed an approval rating of only 70% in the UK and just 58% among young people. Think about that for a moment. Almost a third of the British population cannot say that they support democracy. Research conducted a few years ago by the think tank Onward found that more than a third of under 35-year-old voters believe that putting the army in charge would be a good way to run the country. And nearly a quarter think that democracy is a bad way to run the country. There is a growing dissonance between what voters want from their politics and what is on offer from their parties. Many communities feel left behind by social and economic change, and populist politicians have seized the opportunity to capitalise on a crisis of confidence. Exploiting often understandable concerns, they promote a politics of division, identifying enemies to blame for our problems and offering only easy answers. And frequently, populism aligns with nationalism. And online, disinformation on social media amplifies extremes of view. Our domestic politics is increasingly characterised by rancour in public debate and abuse towards those in public life. We need only to be reminded of the murders of Joe Cox and Sir David Amess, or the scenes at the US Capitol in 2020, to see how fragile support for democracy can be. And from beyond our shores, our adversaries seek to capitalise on this fragility, exploiting our openness, sowing discord in our societies, and attempting to destabilise our liberal way of life. The resilience of democracy and our democratic values is being tested like never before. These developments have combined to create a flashpoint in our democratic story that I believe should concern us all, because less democracy means less freedom, less control over our lives, and less opportunity for generations to come. This is particularly concerning in a world where the balance of power is already shifting away from the democratic West and away from the rules-based international order that has been the guarantor of our security for decades. So it's incumbent on those of us engaged in public life, indeed on anyone who cares for the future of our democracy, to ask ourselves, what can we do? I don't have all the answers, but I do want to touch on what I believe should be 4 central missions in this endeavour: to restore trust in our politicians, to strengthen our parliamentary process, to reinforce our wider democratic institutions, and to protect our democracy from extremism and exploitation. As ever, a good place to start is in the constituency. On my last appearance at the Dispatch Box as Prime Minister, I spoke about the vital link between every member of Parliament and the constituency they represent. While an MP's first duty, as Churchill said, is to what is right for the honour and safety of the country, I called the link between an MP and their constituency the bedrock of our parliamentary democracy and our liberty. I said that because support for our political system depends on the faith placed in MPs by the people we are there to serve. People must feel represented to believe politics is delivering for them. And in our modern representative democracy, it's no longer enough to simply turn up in Westminster and shuffle through the voting lobbies. Our constituencies rightly expect us to be taking up their issues and concerns, fighting their corner, and visible in their communities. What might seem a frivolous constituency engagement to some people, attending a village fete, opening a post office, speaking at a primary school, those are the occasions when voters have an opportunity to see MPs working for them. I'm reminded of the time when I was sitting in Madrid at an international meeting of interior ministers when I was Home Secretary, and the US Homeland Security Secretary asked me what it was like being in a system where, as well as being Home Secretary, I was also an elected Member of Parliament. And I said, well, it's like this. Today I'm sitting with you all discussing counter-terrorism. Tomorrow morning I will open a community vegetable garden. But that vegetable garden was important for those constituents. Our constituents expect us to be making a tangible difference to their everyday lives. MPs may have the power to change legislation, to create new rules which people must follow, but we exercise that power in their interest, not ours. We work in the service of others, and we should be accountable to our voters. Their fundamental expectation is that we play by the rules. It means operating within constitutional norms and meeting the high standards expected of us by Parliament and the public. And of course, playing by the rules means following the law, because we are not a breed apart. We are not special because we are elected. We are not exceptional human beings. The perception of double standards does more than offend a British sense of fair play. It strikes at the core of public trust in politicians. That's why, for instance, the so-called lockdown parties in Downing Street and Whitehall were so damaging and ultimately led to the downfall of that administration. The whole episode suggested that there is a culture of exceptionalism here in Westminster, that the rules somehow don't apply. In fact, having a role in public life requires us as politicians to think more carefully than others about our actions. There are other examples from recent years, of course, including MPs being found to be offering or undertaking paid advocacy, MPs who've been suspended from the House for drunken abuse or harassment. In my own time as Prime Minister, I had to deal with shocking instances of bullying and sexual harassment that have been taking place in Parliament. And of course, the expenses scandal, over 15 years ago, left a deep scar on voters' consciousness, a sense of wrongdoing that has not been forgotten. It only takes a few high-profile instances to damage the reputation of all politicians, no matter how dedicated we might be to our constituents. And it's our collective reputation which determines public trust in the democracy we serve. So the accepted standards of conduct in public life must be a high bar. Indeed, we must engender a culture of high standards. Now, the Nolan principles have now underpinned the ideals of public service in this country since they were first introduced in 1995. Selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. All of us in public life should seek to fulfill those ideals, not just every 5 years when an election looms, but at all times. An important aspect of being able to demonstrate those principles and meet the high expectations of the public is by ensuring we get the right politicians. The type of person who wants to become an MP must be someone who is driven by a sense of service. Somebody who can be content to be elected and simply do a good job for their constituents and their country. Frankly, we could do with fewer MPs entering politics with the sole ambition of becoming a minister. The public is not served by politicians with tunnel vision towards their elevation to high office. In today's politics, it seems like everyone coming into the House wants a long career as a government minister. And for many, it probably doesn't stretch their imagination too far to see themselves as Prime Minister one day. The fact that there aren't enough ministerial jobs for everyone apparently hasn't dampened expectations. So across all parties, we should be constantly looking to ensure our selection procedures are fit for purpose, that they deliver a diversity of candidates, people who want to serve and who recognise their responsibility to their constituents. We also need to ensure that there is an appropriate blend of skills and experience in the House. I believe that outside experience before politics is essential, whether that's in a professional, vocational or voluntary role, but one which carries significant responsibilities. So I've said many MPs think they're capable of being a minister, but it's really nothing like being a backbench MP, and more closely resembles that of a senior executive in a large organisation. You go from having a team of 2 or 3 assistants with virtually no levers to pull, to overseeing a large workforce of thousands with enormous budgets and complex projects to deliver. It's not a task that plays to everyone's strengths. So we should do more to prioritise breadth of experience in candidate recruitment, to widen the collective skill set of the House and enable our MPs to have a better understanding of the issues that affect people day to day. Because the quality of representation, the quality of decision-making, and the quality of scrutiny in our system is strongest when those of us in public life reflect the population we serve. I spoke earlier about playing by the rules. It's especially pertinent in our constitutional system, where adherence to convention is an important element of our democracy. The flexibility afforded by our uncodified constitution has served us well over centuries. By and large, its slow evolution has enabled it to meet the requirements of the day, where other countries have found themselves caught in a legal straitjacket. But our system only works if conventions are not cast aside wholesale, or at least not willfully misrepresented. It rests on those in positions of authority being trusted to uphold the values and traditions of our public life. Now, of course, in our parliamentary system, the role that exemplifies that most is the Speaker of the House of Commons, the one person above all others who is expected to be neutral in their work. The practical, exercisable power held by the Speaker to shape public debate and the work of our legislature is often underreported. The workings of the House are determined officially by the standing orders, but the interpretation and application of those orders is entirely within the hands of the Speaker. In areas where the standing orders are not clear, we consult works of authority such as Erskine May and adhere to proven historical conventions. If we depart from our established constitutional rules to suit short-term interests, we undermine faith in our democratic system. For centuries, we have not needed to have formal mechanisms to hold the Speaker to account. We have been able to rely on him or her to defend our constitutional norms rather than use their high office for political gain. Sadly, that ended with John Bercow, who I believe abused his position to promote his own political view, not just in a single debate, but time and time again. Throughout the Brexit process, it became clear to me that John Bercow had acted to try to thwart the delivery of Brexit and follow his own agenda. Indeed, the impression was that he favoured a second referendum and opposed the policy of the government. And this manifested in several ways. He reinterpreted standing orders, he ruled that amendments could not be laid when the rule should have permitted them to be put down, he overrode the long-standing constitutional convention that the government of the day determines the business of the House. And he effectively tore up the rule book on the use of a humble address, demanded by the Labour Party, which until 2017 had not been used substantively since 1866. It was not only an affront to parliamentary procedure, it also breached another of our fundamental norms in not seeking to involve the monarch in our political debate. Sadly, it's a mechanism which has since become an accepted part of the opposition's armoury. And crucially, at a point where the government's discussions with the DUP had reached the stage where they indicated privately that they would support my Brexit deal, the Speaker ruled that he could not accept another vote, and as a result, the carefully crafted agreement unwound and was to be no more. In my view, that was the point at which we'd lost the opportunity to have delivered an earlier exit from the EU, one which prioritised our economy, was more beneficial for Northern Ireland, and maintained better relationships with our European neighbours. It cannot be right that one person, however unlikely, has the ability to shape and influence our political decision-making with virtually no practical constraints. So I believe we should take a closer look at what checks and balances might be required here. But there is a balance to be struck. We should not throw away a structure that has served us well over centuries because of the behaviour of one individual. And I should also say, for Parliament to function effectively, we cannot wholly outsource that responsibility to the Speaker and the clerks. It's an unfortunate reality that the conventions and standing orders of the House simply aren't understood sufficiently by enough MPs. That's not necessarily the fault of MPs, particularly those new to the House, but it is a failure of the system. Few other large organisations would appoint hundreds of new staff to complex and important roles and offer them barely any training in how to do their job effectively. In 2007, I sat on the Modernisation Committee, which recommended a longer gap between the election and the day the House first meets, partly to make time for an induction programme for new MPs before Parliament started its work. We recommended 12 days, sometimes followed, but by no means the norm. The situation has improved since I entered the House in 1997, but I believe there is still more that can be done to establish a proper training programme for new MPs. And such an initiative should seek the support of all the major parties and could be overseen by the party whips. and I welcome the work that the Hansard Society has been doing in this area through its Building a Better Commons project. Similarly, I welcome the Society's work on reviewing the rules and customs of the House, which will be presented to MPs in the next Parliament. In particular, I support calls for systematic and regular reviews of the standing orders and wider practices and conventions, which may not be sufficiently established in the written rules of the House. And I look forward to reading the recommendations of the task force. Aside from the management of House business, the day-to-day work of MPs in scrutinising the government is a crucial part of our democratic process. And I'm pleased to say that the House of Commons today plays a stronger scrutiny role than the one I encountered in 1997. In particular, I'm thinking of the introduction of debates in the chamber selected by the Backbench Business Committee, and the introduction of debates in Westminster Hall since 1999. I remember leading one such debate in Westminster Hall not long after leaving office. An unusual thing for a former Prime Minister to do, you might think, and I'm told I'm the only former Prime Minister to have done so. Even more surprising was the topic under discussion, perhaps, the reduction of fast rail services through Maidenhead, Twyford and local branch lines. One BBC journalist remarked that I was giving it both barrels on behalf of commuters in my constituency. I chose to raise my constituents' frustrations on this issue because Westminster Hall has become an incredibly effective way of bringing insight from the front line of public service delivery directly to ministers. But there is more the House of Commons can do to perform its scrutiny role more effectively. In the Westminster system, our fusion of powers allows governments to dominate, particularly those with large majorities. Questions, debate, and the committee system all help to hold the executive to account, although they depend to an extent on government's willingness to engage. And I can say, as somebody who spent literally hundreds of hours at the dispatch box and at committee, the experience can be demanding. Nevertheless, I believe that over recent decades, the balance of power has shifted incrementally from the legislature to the executive. I worked on this issue as a member of the Modernisation Select Committee and as shadow leader of the House. And when I delivered my last Hansard Society lecture in 2003 as Conservative Party chairman, I called for the House to be given more powers to scrutinise senior government appointees delivering public services. Of course, during the Brexit debates, we saw efforts by Parliament to wrest control of the agenda from the government, but that stands as an exception to the general trend during my time in the House. And in particular, I am thinking of the shift in emphasis from primary to secondary legislation. Acts of Parliament are increasingly drafted in the broadest and vaguest of terms, with much of the detail left to statutory instruments created at the stroke of a minister's pen. But it's often the detail that tells us how the law will actually affect the lives of the people we represent. Secondary legislation receives substantially less scrutiny, particularly under the negative procedure, in which an instrument is signed by a minister and becomes law before Parliament has had a say in the matter. And 80% of all secondary legislation uses the negative procedure. The instruments cannot be amended, and in practice they are hardly ever rejected. The last time the House of Commons voted down a statutory instrument was in 1979. And compared to that point in time, there are now on average over 1,000 more statutory instruments a year. So if the detail is mainly left to secondary legislation, it will not get the level of scrutiny that it could receive if the provisions are set out on the face of the bill itself. One way to potentially address this challenge is by introducing a new convention that requires the government to provide a draft of secondary legislation that could foreseeably be created alongside the original bill when it is introduced. But ideally, the government should not be leaving significant elements of our laws undecided, and instead be providing more detail within Acts of Parliament themselves. Because secondary legislation is not a tool at the government's disposal for an easy ride, it should not be used to avoid scrutiny. There are other areas too where Parliament should have a stronger voice. The quality of legislation can be improved with more regular use of pre-legislative scrutiny. And Parliament still lacks a systematic approach to undertaking post-legislative scrutiny to find out if our laws are actually working. A dedicated joint committee of Parliament could undertake this task effectively, inviting input from the public. And doesn't it make sense to spend more time asking whether the laws we have passed have worked in the way they were intended? Beyond Parliament itself, we can do more to reinforce the wider institutions of our democracy so that voters can have faith that our system is working effectively and in the interests of the people of this country. I've spoken about the legislative and executive branches, but I should also touch on the judiciary, which I believe has too often come under attack, accusations often emanating from members of Parliament who seek to use judges and the courts as scapegoats for their own political failings. I fear the distinction between the role of judge and legislator is being lost in today's world and sometimes willfully conflated. Parliamentary sovereignty has for centuries been the central tenet of our Constitution, asserting the authority of Parliament as the supreme legal body in this land. MPs make the law. Judges interpret and implement it. We should not bemoan judges' interpretation of the law as it stands. Instead, it is the responsibility of legislators to make better law. The judiciary know that if they publicly promote a political view, they open themselves to challenge. Of course, it's entirely legitimate to disagree personally with one legal ruling or another. I certainly have done. But that does not entitle people to question the integrity of individual justices or bring into question the legitimacy of our legal system. By undermining the judiciary in this way, we further erode public faith in the institutions of our democracy and therefore in democracy itself. There is conventional wisdom in Westminster that the public are hostile towards judges having a say in determining politically controversial matters. But in fact, the public value our courts for this very role. This was borne out in a YouGov survey conducted last year for the UCL Constitution Unit, which found a clear majority of people support a central role for judges at the heart of our constitutional system. In fact, it found that public trust was much higher in the court system than in politicians, and most people wanted strong roles for the courts in protecting human rights and adjudicating on the limits of government powers. So I say to those seeking to villainize a judiciary that cannot easily answer back, who willfully discredit our legal system for their own expediency, it's time to show responsible leadership. I say responsible leadership because faith in politics is underscored by the taking of responsibility. Taking responsibility for one's own actions rather than blaming others. And for those in positions of leadership, taking responsibility for the actions of those we lead. It is particularly inexcusable to see the civil service repeatedly and publicly vilified and blamed when policy isn't working in the way politicians intended. Over the years, I've had the privilege to work alongside thousands of dedicated officials and have seen at first hand the professionalism and commitment they bring to their roles. Like in any workplace, it is entirely proper to expect high performance. I suspect the civil servants who've worked for me over the years would say I could be a demanding minister. But I would like to think that they knew that when challenge came, it was respectful and was motivated by a desire to see policy work and for government to be effective. But in our system, the buck stops with ministers. And it's been my experience at the highest levels of government that, far from the tropes of satirical comedies, ministers are in charge. The seals of office do not confer power without responsibility. Suggesting that the objectives of elected politicians are being blocked by the civil service or government departments or the judiciary or by another kind of establishment stitch-up simply develops a narrative that organs of the state are somehow anti-democratic. This damaging rhetoric weakens faith in our system of government, it undermines faith in elected office, and undermines support for our democracy. Finally, I would like to pick up on a theme I touched upon earlier, that protecting our politics from extremism and exploitation is fundamental to the health of our democracy. We are living in an age of populism and easy answers. Sadly, our politics increasingly presents the world through an absolutist prism of winners and losers. The winners are seen as strong men. They believe that if you stand firm in your position for long enough, you will always get your way. They prefer to agitate their own faction rather than find common ground. They believe that walking out and slamming the door is strength, where compromise is weakness. This is corroding our public debate. It drives tribal bitterness, subverts freedom of speech, and damages the health of our democracy. All great news for our adversaries, who seek to undermine us by targeting vulnerabilities within democratic systems and in liberal society. Adversaries like Vladimir Putin, who pursues policies designed to disrupt Western democracy and upend the post-war international order, which he believes has served Western interests over his own. I'm not revealing state secrets when I tell you that the UK is under constant pressure from Russian espionage, from those who seek to infiltrate our political and commercial life, who seek to recruit informants, commit sabotage, blackmail, cause disorder, and create distrust. And increasingly, this activity takes place in cyberspace, where Russia is a sophisticated player that can intrude into private networks, threaten critical national infrastructure, and has attempted to influence our democratic processes. And of course, Russia isn't the only state seeking to undermine our way of life. Commonly, Russia sets out to spread disinformation and run influence campaigns. And historically, its own state-owned media, channels like Russia Today and Sputnik, have attempted to implant Russian narratives directly into Western society. But perhaps most significantly, it has exploited the inherent weaknesses of social media in being able to easily amplify untruths on an exponential scale. And regrettably, in recent years, it's experienced some success. Its online bots and trolls disseminate false facts and pernicious narratives designed to deepen our existing divisions within society and to undermine faith in democracy and our values. And unfortunately, our adversaries can too often rely on a chorus of online extremists and conspiracy theorists to amplify this content, driving up the salience of the most divisive issues facing the Western world, pitting sections of our society against one another, enabling extreme political views to become an accepted feature of our public debate, and weakening the very fabric of our democracies. So to protect against exploitation from foreign adversaries, we need to work towards cohesion and cooperation in our politics at home, not driving polarization in our society, but bridging divides wherever they exist. It has always been my view that the best long-term solutions arise from the politics of moderation. In my party, we have a tradition of mainstream centre-right conservatism. We call it One Nation. It encapsulates the idea that we should seek to bring people together, not create a society of warring cultural tribes. And to bring people together, politicians must seek to get things done rather than simply get them said. But to get things done in a democracy requires a willingness to compromise, to painstakingly search for the common ground. Being prepared to make compromises in order to make progress does not mean compromising on our values. Rather, it is precisely the way to defend them. So as I prepare to vacate my seat in the House of Commons, I look to tomorrow's MPs to put this into practice. And I say to them, the future of our democracy is in your hands. Live up to the responsibilities of your office. Don't reach for the easy answers. Demonstrate that compromise is not a dirty word. Above all, remember that being a member of Parliament is not a position of power, but a position of service. Service to your constituents, service to Parliament, and service to your country. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Teresa. Fascinating speech. I'd just like to pick up on a few points with you because obviously the audience hadn't heard that speech. We've got some questions coming from them, but then we'll come back to the audience questions in just a minute. But I want to start by relating the beginning of your lecture to the end, actually. Those statistics you gave us about young people not wanting democracies, I think were absolutely chilling. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on why you think this is happening, and does it relate to what you were talking about at the end of your speech, which was Putin and the threat from Russia and social media and all of that? Or is it much more than that? What do you think is the main reason for this really astonishing and very worrying decline in people wanting democracy?
I think there are a couple of things I would say for that, particularly in relation to young people. I mean, I think my own view is that social media does have an impact on this. I think social media amplifies extreme views. And I think there are some young people, I was speaking to some sixth form level students last week, and one of them was saying, you know, how do we know where to go for facts? How do we know what to believe? And I think this is one of the issues in terms of what people see constantly on social media. And I worry that increasingly the platforms and AI and so forth push people towards seeing what the system thinks their view is already, in a sense, and they're not enabled to see the general debate. But I think there is an issue that politicians have to recognise for a lot of young people. We've always sort of believed, I've certainly believed, that actually we try to improve people's lives and that every generation feels it can have a better life than the previous generation. And I think for young people today who find it difficult to afford their own home, who are dealing with those sorts of issues, they perhaps feel that the politicians in the democracy haven't delivered for them in the way they would have expected. And I think that probably has an impact as well.
Okay. You've been Home Secretary and Prime Minister, obviously, so you know a lot more than we do about what's been going on sort of with the security services and Russian spies, etc. Are we sort of living in a slight fool's paradise about the extent of that involvement and the degree to which, say, the next election is going to be an awful lot of Russian interference?
Well, I think that you just always have to be aware that this is an issue, that there are states out there who want to undermine our way of life and undermine our democracy. And of course, as we have seen the technology develop, what we need to do is make sure that we have the capacity and the capability to be able to deal with that and to be able to resist that as far as we can. I think there are issues for us on the, just going back to your first question on social media and my answer on it, I think one of the things we need to do as well is just help to sort of educate people about how they best deal with social media and seeing what is being put across it. And you have situations where social media, not because of hostile state activity, but where social media can impact on the result of an election, as it did in the Gower when my colleague Byron Davis lost his seat, and there was actually a court case against an individual who'd put something erroneous on social media, but it has had an impact. So I have to say the act that the government has put through to try to find some way of getting a framework around the use of social media at these times is important, but it is, an early attempt, in a sense, to be able to do that.
Yeah. I was very interested in what you were saying about us not necessarily getting the right MPs and that too many people going into Parliament have just got an eye on that ministerial seat around the cabinet table. What can be done to make sure that doesn't happen? You talk about bringing in people with a breadth of experience. So where does the problem lie? Is it with the selection processes from the parties, do you think? Or is it the kind of people that even think they want to go into Parliament? Are there too many sort of MP's assistant, for example, that think, oh, I'll try that next?
Yes, I mean, I think, as I said at one point, I think it's very important that people have experience outside politics before they become a member of parliament. And I think we have sadly seen a trend in recent years of people who've just been working in politics going into becoming members of parliament. And that's, you know, I have to put my hand up. I called a snap election in 2017, but there was another snap election in 2019. And so you tend to get people selected at the last minute, which can add to that issue. But I think the parties do need to think very carefully about how they select their candidates and the qualifications and characteristics that they're looking for. And I think integrity is one of the key things that they should be looking for. I think we do need to try to encourage people from a variety of areas of life to be willing to come into Parliament and to feel that they can contribute and make a difference to people's lives.
And then the training or lack of it that MPs get once they're elected, that's surely relatively easy to solve, isn't it? You put in process a proper induction. I mean, I don't think MPs even get a proper induction, do they? Such as you would if you joined a company or something.
Yes, I mean, it's improved since 1997 when I went in, but you still don't have that sense of a proper induction programme. I think there are attempts both by parties and by the House of Commons authorities and over the years they've put more elements into place. But the issue then is actually, should you require new MPs to go through that process? I think if you look at the statistics of people who tend to attend these sessions, it's really quite low. There's probably an element of older MPs probably saying to them, oh, well, you know, you don't need to worry about that. You just listen to me and I'll tell you how it all works. But actually that sort of robust. And it's interesting, when the Modernisation Committee looked at it back in 2007, we actually looked at what happens in the United States, and there is a proper induction programme in relation to Congress.
I don't know if you follow the excellent Michael Crick, who's been monitoring all the selected candidates in a tagline, Tomorrow's MPs, that he does. And
that's where I got all my information about who's
exactly,
being,
don't we all? Well, he came to speak to the Hansard Society, another plug, a few months back, and he was saying that the changing trend, he thinks, for this coming election is that a lot of the selected candidates are local candidates, so they are, hopefully, as you would want, more constituency-minded. Do you think that will lead to a better Parliament next time round?
Well, I think there's two ways of looking at that. One is that obviously they're already within a constituency, but I think it suggests sometimes that seats aren't looking at the breadth of skills and experience that somebody needs to be a good member of Parliament. You know, when I was selected for Maidenhead, I didn't live in Maidenhead. I wasn't a local councillor in Maidenhead. I'd been a local councillor in London. But I made myself local.
Yeah.
Moved into the constituency, got stuck in, and got to know the local area and the constituency.
Yeah. I was quite struck by one bit of your speech, which was about John Bercow. And you've written a book, by the way, I should have mentioned Teresa's book, Abuse of Power, where you mentioned him a few times as well. And so I knew already that you felt strongly about him, but you seem to blame him almost single-handedly for your Brexit deal not going through. Is that a bit harsh? Were there not people in your own party, for example, who felt very strongly? Yeah, I mean, and you know, at the end of the day, I failed to get the deal through. But there was that one point where you may recall that for some members of my party, the view the DUP took was very important to them. And there was that one point where privately the DUP had said they were going to support the deal, and we've been talking about how to sort of, you know, make that public and then have the vote. And the Speaker said he wasn't willing to allow the motion to go before the House. And at that point, that agreement fell through. And I think had we been able to get it through at that point, then we would have had, I think, we would have been able to get the deal accepted by Parliament. And do you think at that time MPs, well, certainly your MP, should have been able to say, this is not acceptable, the Speaker is overreaching his powers?
Well, I think that there was no opportunity to come back. That's the thing. I think there is something there that needs to be looked at in terms of the problem is, as I indicated, you've had for centuries of Parliament, the Speaker being the person who is that ultimate decision maker, if you like, in some senses. And you can't just sort of change an entire structure just for because one person has behaved in a particular way. But I think that possibly is because of that, and potentially that sets a precedent in the future for others, potentially, that there should be some means of being able to have some sort of form of greater accountability.
Well, that was one bit of bad behaviour. Do you think that in any way led to, shall we say, more bad behaviour? You talked about the lockdown parties. A vague sense that the rules were there to be broken, not to be obeyed by parliamentarians.
I think it was, I think it fed into this sense that somehow for those in Whitehall, everything was different. They could, and that's what I think the public disliked, this sense that they were doing their best to abide by the rules, and yet here were people who were not doing so. And that, in a sense, feeds into what, and as if you've given a plug for my book, I'll also say I've written in my book about this sense from MPs, from a lot of MPs over the years, that somehow they are set apart, they are different. I remember having a conversation early on when I was entered the House of Commons in the members' tea room with a long-standing member of Parliament who I referred to being an MP as a job. And he said, it's not a job, we're elected. I said, actually, it is a job. It is a place of work. And yes, we get selected for that job in a different way from other people, from somebody working in a company, for example. But it is still a job, it's still work, and we're working there in service to others. And I think that sense somehow that we were a breed apart has existed in Parliament for too long.
And yet these days there's an awful lot of abuse, as you said, in political life, in political language. I mean, MPs these days are very often sort of looked down on, abused, and worse. So how do you sort of marry that together with the, MPs think they're very special?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. And of course, a lot of that abuse and threats and harassment, and there have been some horrific things are said to MPs, particularly female MPs, has come through social media. I'm not sure that there is a dichotomy there. I mean, it's in a sense, perhaps MPs thinking that they're somehow a breed apart, people are seeing MPs in a quite different light, and maybe we do need to think about how we present ourselves to the public, I think, and how we show what we believe our role is.
Yeah, bridge that gap between how MPs see themselves and how the public see them.
Yes.
I'm going to have to come on to parliamentary scrutiny, because otherwise Ruth Fox will sack me from the Hansard Society. I could feel her excitement when you're talking about statutory instruments. But you talk a lot about, the way scrutiny has to be made better, both pre-legislative and post-legislative. Do you think there's an open door there that you're knocking on, or do you think people are still very much, we like it the way when government can just decide what it wants?
I think that experience, shows us that when you have pre-legislative scrutiny, by and large, you end up with better bills, or with less need to amend them when they're going through the House of Commons or the House of Lords. And so there is an advantage there. Of course, from government's point of view, there's a time issue, because if you go through pre-legislative scrutiny, it adds an extra element to the timetable of getting a bill through. But I think I would hope there was a bit of an open door there, precisely because people have seen that you can get better legislation. Of course, you've then got to put the legislation through. And here I give my plug for the mental health bill, because that's gone through pre-legislative scrutiny and it's sitting there, and I want it to become an act. It hasn't been brought forward yet. But also at the other end, I think post-leg scrutiny, at an appropriate time, and you have to decide when that is, when you've actually able properly to judge the impact. But doesn't it make sense to say, we did this, did it work? It seems kind of
Seems fairly obvious,
basic.
doesn't it?
Yes.
Fairly obvious. I mean, there are a lot of complaints these days about the small amount of time for which Parliament sits at the moment. Is that something that could be looked at, do you think?
Well, if you think about, it actually sits slightly longer than it did when, I'm trying to work out the weeks, but of course we have the September sittings, which we didn't have when I first went into Parliament. But of course the hours have changed. I think the hours changing is right.
Yes.
I think by and large Parliament probably sits sufficiently. We have added things into the parliamentary agenda, of course, with the backbench business committee debates, which obviously take time that otherwise would have been given to government legislation. that perhaps there's a sort of slight potential break on governments in terms of the number of pieces of legislation it brings forward. I have to say, when I was in Shadow Leader of the House, I did propose to my colleagues that we should actually have a self-denying ordinance and say we'd only bring so many bills into Parliament in a particular session. And I was told by some of the old hands, no, that's absolutely, don't go there. And then I became Home Secretary and I thought, no, don't go there. Because as a Home Office, you always have more legislation to bring forward.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to throw open the whole discussion now to some questions, but I've just got one final question, which is you've talked a lot about the importance of public service, and I think you still very much are interested in being a public servant. Might we see a time when you could come back in some shape or form, whether it's Keir Starmer comes along and says, would you like to head up this commission into reform of Parliament or something like that? Do you see yourself ever coming back into that role, or are you just done with it?
I have to say, I think it's, been there, got the T-shirt, if you like to speak. And I've set up a global commission on modern slavery and human trafficking, which is going to be taking a lot of my time over the coming years.
Right. So done that. Thank you. Now, what we're going to do, I've got quite a lot of questions have been sent in, and rather than spend hours waiting for people to get the microphone, if I can try and identify you a little bit ahead of time. So is Alan Lewis in the room? Yes? Could you give Alan Lewis the microphone first? Where's the microphone? People gone? There we are. I can't see very well the lights. What I'll do is I'll group the questions a bit. So Alan, your question is going to be grouped with some others. So while we're getting the microphones, I'll read a couple of the others and then you can ask, and then Teresa will have a couple of questions to answer. So this first sort of section is about parliamentary reform, really. And Alex McCarthy has asked, do you think reform is needed for MPs' conduct? And if so, is the goal to improve the efficiency of the sessions or the optics to the public? And then Professor Meg Russell has said, you had a difficult and often frustrating time with Parliament over Brexit, but sometimes your language regarding Parliament and parliamentarians became very critical. Do you think the kind of Parliament versus people narrative which developed during Brexit is in hindsight regrettable? So that's another question. And Alan, if you can ask your question now.
PMQs is at best a joke and at worst a national embarrassment. What would you do to reform or abolish it altogether?
Right, so there's a group of questions.
Yes, a group of questions on that there. And if I forget any of them, I'll come back to you. Let me take the PMQs one first. In a sense, I mean, one of the problems of PMQs is that it shows a very adversarial House of Commons, which means that most people only see that adversarial approach and don't see the debates debates on topics, the bill committees, the scrutiny of legislation, the select committees and so forth. But is it right that the Prime Minister should be subjected to a weekly session where they have to answer questions? Actually, yes, I think it probably is. You can try and do PMQs in a slightly different way. The problem is actually MPs want PMQs to be adversarial because that's their moment of getting behind their person and, really going for it. I think that you can try to make sure that questions and answers have a greater statesman-like approach, if I can put it like that, in PMQs, but I wouldn't abolish it. I think as Secretaries of State and ministers have to answer questions regularly, I think it is important that the Prime Minister is to be able to hold to account in that way. And okay, you brief yourself, you read up every possible subject you think you're going to be asked about. And then you have moments like the time I had when I thought Jeremy Corbyn was probably going to ask me about some European EU Brexit issue that had come up and really mugged up on it. And he asked me 6 questions on buses. I can reveal now that fortunately somebody sitting behind me was on the Transport Select Committee. And they wrote 2 sentences on a piece of paper about buses and passed it to me. And I had to make 6 answers out of those 2 sentences. There was another one about sort of general
MPs'
behaviour
conduct,
and MPs'
yes.
conduct. I mean, I think this is one of the issues about what I mentioned, the sort of rancour in public debate and the sort of attitudes that's taken. Now, we have, I think, some of the protocols we have in the House of Commons are important in this aspect. The fact that you cannot point across the chamber at somebody and call, you think this, you think, but you have to say on the honourable member, the right honourable, I think is important because it has that sort of, takes a bit of that rancour out. But actually, because the debate generally in public has got coarser, I fear it's the same in Parliament. And I think as MPs, we should be trying to have perhaps a higher level of debate when we're discussing issues that matter to people's everyday lives.
And isn't the awful yah-booing something? I don't know how you ever stop that, but that sort of awful kind of, you know, rugby club type sort of woo.
It's, I mean, I think you are bound to get a certain degree of agreement with your person's point of view and disagreement with somebody else's point of view. There are one or two individuals in the House of Commons who've taken it to a level beyond which it has been before, if I can put it like that. Yeah. But I think that's part of trying to sort of just row back and say, look, this isn't, it partly goes into the PMQ's point, obviously, because that's when it gets seen most, is, and you know, and the Speaker now, Lindsay, you know, constantly stands up and reminds us that our constituents are watching.
Yes, yes. And that's been
and there was another...
The other bit was about, do you regret your sort of Parliament versus people narrative, you know, where it was, I think, your Downing Street statement of March 2019, says Professor Meg Russell.
That's right. It was one statement I made outside Downing Street where, I mean, the message I was trying to get across was, I'm going to deliver for you. I want to deliver for you. I know Parliament has been stopping it, but I'm going to sort of plough on and aim to continue to deliver for you. It was taken as a sort of Parliament versus people moment. But in a sense, I mean, I regret it in the sense that it was interpreted in a way I hadn't intended. I don't regret trying to make the point that actually what Parliament should be doing is delivering what the people wanted. And what we were getting increasingly was a debate in Parliament that was about the interests of the two sides rather than that overall common good and common ground.
Yeah. Thank you. Now we're going to come on to women in politics. We have to have that, don't we? Is Kimberly Pilley here? Kimberly Pilley? No? Yes? Right, could we get a microphone to Kimberly, please, who will ask her question in a minute. And meanwhile, we've had actually two quite similar questions to go with this on women in politics. One from Frederick Green, one from Vivian Gardner, which is, how does the treatment of women prime ministers differ from the treatment of male prime ministers? And Kimberly, if you'd like to ask your question as well, and then we can have a...
I know I worded it slightly different when I submitted it as a question, but after hearing your speech, I want to word it slightly differently. Especially with the growing ubiquity of like technology among young people, would you say that given the opportunity now, if you were like a young woman going into politics, would you stand as a Conservative candidate again, knowing how like susceptible it is for criticism for the Conservative Party among young people?
Oh, definitely. I am a Conservative and I would stand as a Conservative candidate. I think there are issues sometimes for young people in feeling that they can't. I was at an event recently where a young woman was saying to me she found it difficult to express her political views because she thought she was going to get, effectively attacked, and the social media response could be so difficult. But if you believe in something, I think it's important to stand up for it. And so I would definitely still be that Conservative candidate. As to the attitude towards women leaders, as opposed to male leaders, I think there are just generally some different attitudes towards women and men in politics. And for example, if a man shows emotion, it's wonderful, that's the other side of him. If a woman shows emotion, it's typical woman, weak. I'm afraid that's just an attitude that is still taken, is still there.
Yeah.
Women, well, I'm tempted to say women do get, I think, more attention to how they dress, although I saw an article today about Rishi and Keir and how they were dressing and what that meant.
Yes, I saw that too. It's the first time, isn't it? We're talking about men's trousers and things like that, rather than women's jackets and hairstyle. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I mean, just as a more general question, because as I say, we worked together all those years ago on getting more women into Parliament. Are you sort of pleased with where we're at now, or do you think there's still a long way to go?
I think there's still room for improvement, and I think there's still, because the problem in Parliament is that however many women you get as candidates for any particular party, how many women actually enter Parliament depends on the electoral cycle, and so you have constantly to be working at it.
Yeah.
And I think there is still an element in some parts of parties that of making it natural for a woman to be a candidate, rather than people still thinking that maybe they want the male candidate. So I'm afraid I think there is still work for us to do.
Yes, and I think not great news on the candidates coming in on the male-female thing. Right, we're going to do something completely different now. We're going to come to foreign affairs. So is Francis de Souza here? Yes. Well, so we'll take your question in just a second. If the microphone could come over to Francis, please. Former Lord Speaker, by the way, I should add. And alongside this question, I'm going to throw you a few more that have come in, Teresa, on foreign affairs. One is from Nicholas Clemo. Do you believe that the future defence of the UK will potentially require the need for conscription? Talk of that in Germany. And then France is going to ask hers. And another one, Martin England, regarding Brexit. You once said no deal for Britain is better than a bad deal for Britain. Are you pleased at how Brexit is working out? Francis, if you'd like to ask yours as well, and then there's a wide variety there for Teresa to answer.
I wonder whether, as a former Prime Minister, you could say something about what kind of pathway you might take towards regularizing relationships with regimes such as the Taliban in Afghanistan. Presumably we have at one point to negotiate with that country, but how?
Yeah, I'm afraid you've got quite a wide selection there.
And I think Francis's is it's a very difficult question to answer, because I mean, I have said that I regret the way we withdrew from Afghanistan. I would have preferred to have seen whether it would be possible, regardless of the US position, for a number of countries, the UK and others, to maintain some presence there. I think what has happened, particularly to women and girls in Afghanistan following the takeover by the Taliban, is really, I mean, it's deeply sad, and we've done so much for those women and girls to give them a different future. I'm not sure, you say we negotiate with how do you take a path to negotiations with regimes like the Taliban? I mean, there are regimes around the world where it is not an everyday occurrence for you actually to be actively negotiating with those regimes. There are certain issues that you have to deal with, and in the case of Afghanistan, obviously, there's always been the question of the humanitarian situation there. But you cannot have the same sort of relationships with every single regime around the world. There are variations in this, and I think as foreign policy develops, as different changes come about within the geopolitics of the world, at any point in time, you have to take a decision as to whether that's a point at which you do want to be speaking to certain regimes because of certain circumstances that have arisen. Foreign policy is complex and often very messy, if I can put it like that. It's not always a simple black or white scenario. And you just have to think about and adapt, but always have your base values behind what you're doing according to the circumstances that fit. Conscription, of course, is something that if you talk to anybody in the military, they would rather have people who willingly have joined the military. rather than conscription. So I don't see that as coming down the line anytime soon. And there was a third question about Brexit.
Brexit.
Oh, how could I forget?
How could you forget Brexit? Are you pleased with how Brexit is working out? I think it's a very polite way of putting it.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think I think it's good that we've got the Windsor framework that has helped to deal with the Northern Ireland situation. I was concerned about the position that had been negotiated in relation to Northern Ireland, because I always said that we couldn't put a border down the Irish Sea. So I'm pleased that that has developed. I think what we will see in coming years is, and in a sense we've seen this in the response to Ukraine, a recognition that actually, you know, European allies are our closest geographical allies, and there will be issues on which it makes sense for us to be working with them. As I say, Ukraine has shown the importance of that and being willing to accept that. I think at the moment, I would say we're probably still in a position where you can't really identify exactly the impact that Brexit has had, because we had COVID. Yeah. And then we had the invasion of Ukraine and the impact that had on energy costs. And so we're still coming out of the impacts of those, in a sense, before we can actually see exactly what impact Brexit has had.
Thank you. We're now going back to parliamentary reform. Is Stephen Mepham around? Yes, here we are. If this gentleman could have a microphone, and while Stephen's getting the microphone, there are a couple of other questions that go along with this. Liam Hamilton says, what do you think is required to get people re-engaged with politics and back into the polling stations? Talking about low turnout there. And Ignacio asks, arguably the most reformist, more successful UK government of the 21st century was the coalition government. Arguably, and that's my arguably. Coalition governments are the norm in more successful democracies around the globe. Why is a hung parliament such a toxic concept within the UK establishment? And Stephen.
Thank you. Are you in favour of the state funding of parliamentary parties?
3 on parliamentary reform.
Yes, and the answer to that is no, I'm not in favour of state funding of parliamentary parties. But I think we could look, and I've argued in the past, at possibly some sort of means of encouraging people. I mean, parliamentary parties actually would be better if they had multiple, very large numbers of people were supporting them. You could look, I think I argued in front of a House of Lords committee once, that we should have some sort of tax break for people who were providing donations to political parties. Not sure now whether that's such a good idea. But I think I don't think state funding would be the way forward. And I've conveniently forgotten.
You've forgotten hung parliaments. Why do we think hung parliaments are dreadful?
Well, first of all, I think that we get the parliaments that people want us to have. I think in 2010, we got a coalition government because the British people wanted change, but they didn't quite think they could let the Conservatives have rip, if you like, and be fully in government. And that's why we got to the position of the coalition. We were fortunate in that because of the hard work of a small number of people on the Conservative and Liberal Democrat sides, we were able to put a coalition together very quickly. If you look at the situation, and obviously there's a particular reason for this at the moment, but if you look at the situation in the Netherlands, for example, I mean, it takes, but traditionally it has always taken quite a long time for them to put their coalition governments together. The advantage of our system, by and large, is that you get a government, you know within a day or two who that government is going to be, and they are able then to get into office and actually start working on their policies, rather than having a sort of interim period where nobody really is in charge because everybody's trying to bring a coalition together in such a, as you see in some other countries where they have so many different parties that they want to bring together.
Good. And the final one was, how do you get people re-engaged and back into the polling stations? Because quite a lot of people just don't vote these days, do they?
Well, no, I mean, but what's interesting, I think if you look at polling, at turnout figures, actually where there's a tight contest, you tend to get higher turnout than, so in a sense, it's, if people feel that their vote is, in a sense, going to count, I think you are likely to get, higher turnout. But I think that's part of the issue, of course, is getting young people to turn out to vote. And I'm often, sometimes asked by young people, how do we actually encourage more young people to be interested? And it's great that we have students here in the audience this evening. And my answer is always, well, actually, it's important to vote because it's about your future. Who is in government is going to determine the sort of country you are developing in. If you're a young adult, the sort of country that, you're making your initial adult life in. So it's important for you to have your say. And if you don't think that, if you think that all the issues governments appear to address or political parties appear to address are ones that older people care about, it's probably because those older people vote. And so actually going out and voting and expressing your view is very important.
Well, I think that's a very good note to finish on. And I know you're going to briefly meet some of the school students here in just a minute. So I'd like to say thank you very much for that. Just another plug for the Hansard Society. If you're interested in parliamentary democracy and parliamentary reform, do please either join the Hansard Society or give us some money, which you can do via our website. Thank you very much. I haven't finished. I haven't quite finished with the plugs yet. I want to plug our wonderful new podcast, which is done by Ruth Fox, our great director, and Mark Darcy, former BBC parliamentary correspondent. It's actually a great listen. You'd think, oh, this is a bit dull, but it's funny, it's fantastic. I think it's one of the best. So do listen to their podcast, where they will be looking into Theresa May's lecture and also Lucy Powell's speech earlier today on reform of Parliament. But, there's much else there besides. It's called Parliament Matters, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts, or you can go onto our website and sign up. You find it there. We have another 80th anniversary year event coming up in July. We have Neil Kinnock and John Major, who, of course, famously fought that 1992 election when many thought Neil Kinnock would win and John Major did. I don't think, and I haven't fact-checked this, but I don't think they've appeared together at a public event since then. And we have them coming in July, so do come along to that. Again, details on our website. And so now it really does just remain for me to say a huge thank you to Theresa May, a fantastic lecture, very thought-provoking. Thank you for coming.